The Library of Congress houses extensive collections of photographs from the slavery era and Reconstruction period. But some images are so disturbing in their composition and so revealing of exploitation that they challenge viewers to understand the many ways enslaved people were dehumanized. On a morning in March 2025, archivist Dr. Patricia Williams examines a recently donated collection that will lead her to uncover one of the most unusual and disturbing cases of photographic exploitation she has encountered. A case where twin sisters in Alabama repeatedly photographed an enslaved man in staged, humiliating poses designed to display him as a curiosity and spectacle. Photographs that the man himself later testified were intended to degrade him and to create images the sisters could show to visitors as evidence of their power and their possession of an unusually strong enslaved person. Exploitation that continued for years until emancipation freed him and allowed him to testify about the psychological torture of being repeatedly posed and photographed as if he were an exhibit rather than a human being. The donation comes from a historical society in Alabama that has been researching the use of photography in slavery and how enslaved people were forced to participate in images designed to dehumanize them. The letter explains that while examining materials from the 1860s, 1870s, researchers discovered a photograph along with testimony from the man depicted, testimony that provides crucial context for understanding the image as documentation of exploitation rather than as a neutral portrait. Patricia carefully removes the materials from their archival box. The first item is a photograph, styled to resemble an 1870s porch portrait, showing a strikingly staged scene. A black man stands at the center, shirtless, his muscular torso held upright with rigid stillness. His expression is neutral, almost stoic, his gaze fixed slightly above the camera, as though instructed not to look directly at it. His suspenders hang over his shoulders in a way that seems deliberately aesthetic, emphasizing his physical presence. Flanking him on both sides are two white women who appear to be twins or sisters, dressed in identical dark Victorian gowns with high collars and full skirts. Both women are visibly pregnant. They mirror each other's posture with uncanny precision. Each places one hand on her own stomach and the other on the man's shoulder. Their expressions are composed, serene, showing no tension or discomfort. The symmetry is perfect, matching hairstyles, matching dresses, mirror image hand placements. The backdrop shows a large, well-kept home with white porch railings, suggesting wealth and status. The entire composition feels ritualistic, staged with deliberate precision. What strikes Patricia most powerfully is how carefully choreographed the image is. The perfect symmetry, the deliberate positioning, the man's shirtless display, the women's identical poses. This is not a casual photograph. This is a carefully staged tableau designed to create a specific visual effect. Patricia turns the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Isaac with the Hartwell sisters, Alabama, 1867. Photograph taken 2 years after emancipation at the sisters' request. Isaac was enslaved by the Hartwell family and was repeatedly photographed in staged, humiliating poses by twin sisters Margaret and Catherine Hartwell. The sisters collected these photographs and displayed them to visitors as evidence of their ownership of an unusually strong enslaved man. Isaac later testified about the psychological torture of being repeatedly posed and photographed like an exhibit. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later, they treated him like a living museum display. They posed him, photographed him, showed the images to guests as if he were an exotic specimen they owned. The exploitation was psychological, making him perform for the camera, turning him into a spectacle. He testified about this after freedom, documenting how photography was used as a tool of dehumanization. Patricia reads the inscription 3 times, her stomach tightening. Isaac had been forced to pose repeatedly for photographs designed to display him as a curiosity, as a specimen, as evidence of the sisters' ownership of something unusual. The sisters had collected these photographs and used them to demonstrate their power. And after emancipation, Isaac had given testimony documenting this specific form of exploitation. Patricia spends the rest of that day examining the other materials in the package. What she finds is extraordinary. Isaac's detailed testimony given to researchers in 1868, describing years of being photographed by the Hartwell sisters. Additional photographs from the same series showing Isaac in various staged poses, and contemporary accounts from people who had been shown these photographs by the sisters, and who described how the images were used to display the sisters' possession of an unusually strong, enslaved man. From Isaac's testimony, given in Montgomery, Alabama, in June 1868, "My name is Isaac Freeman. I chose the name Freeman after emancipation because it represents freedom from bondage and freedom from being displayed and exhibited like property. I was born enslaved in Alabama in approximately 1840. I was enslaved by the Hartwell family, who owned a large plantation near Montgomery. In 1858, when I was approximately 18 years old, the Hartwell family's twin daughters, Margaret and Catherine, who were approximately 20 years old, became interested in photography. Photography was becoming more accessible in the late 1850s, and the sisters acquired a camera and learned how to take photographs. The sisters began photographing various subjects on the plantation: buildings, landscapes, other enslaved people. But they became particularly interested in photographing me. I was tall and physically strong, which the sisters seemed to find unusual or remarkable. They began staging photographs where I would be posed in ways designed to display my physical strength. At first, the photographs were relatively simple, standing poses, working poses. But over time, the photographs became more elaborate and more humiliating. The sisters would instruct me to remove my shirt, so my muscular build would be more visible. They would pose me in specific positions, holding heavy objects, standing with arms flexed, positioned in ways that emphasized my physical appearance. I had no power to refuse. I was enslaved. When the sisters instructed me to pose for photographs, I had to comply regardless of how uncomfortable or humiliating the poses were. The sisters collected these photographs and displayed them to visitors to the plantation. When guests came to the house, the sisters would bring out their photograph albums and show images of me. They would describe me as their strongest specimen or their most impressive property. They would discuss my physical attributes as if I were a prize animal they owned. Sometimes they would summon me to the house so guests could see me in person after viewing the photographs. This continued for years, from approximately 1858 until emancipation in 1865. Over those 7 years, the sisters took dozens of photographs of me in various staged poses. Each time, I had to stand still for long periods while the camera exposure was made. Each time, I had to follow their instructions about how to stand, where to look, how to position my body. Each time, I had to endure being treated as a living exhibit rather than as a person. The psychological impact of this was profound. I was already enslaved, already denied basic human dignity and autonomy. But being repeatedly photographed and displayed added an additional layer of dehumanization. The photographs turned me into an object that could be shown to others, discussed, examined. Even when I wasn't physically present, images of me were being displayed and discussed as if I were a curiosity or specimen. I also understood that these photographs were being preserved permanently. Unlike verbal discussions or temporary displays, photographs created permanent records of my humiliation. The sisters were creating lasting documentation of my exploitation that could be shown to people for years or decades to come. The photograph you have been given, showing me posed between the two sisters, was taken in 1867, 2 years after emancipation. By this time I was legally free, but the sisters convinced me to pose for one more photograph. They told me they wanted a final image for their collection. I was still living in the area, and still economically dependent on finding work, and the Hartwell family still had power and influence. I felt I could not refuse their request. The photograph shows me posed shirtless between the twin sisters, who both happened to be pregnant at that time. The sisters posed with their hands on my shoulders and on their own stomachs, creating a perfectly symmetrical composition. The photograph was carefully staged. Everything about the positioning, the matching dresses, the symmetry, was deliberate. After this final photograph was taken, I left the area and moved to another part of Alabama, where I could build a life away from the Hartwell family. But I remained troubled by the knowledge that photographs of me, taken during slavery and immediately after, existed and might be displayed for years to come. I am giving this testimony because I want several things documented. First, I want the historical record to show that photography was used as a tool of exploitation during slavery. Enslaved people were forced to pose for photographs designed to dehumanize us, to display us as curiosities or specimens, to create permanent records of our exploitation. Second, I want people to understand that the impact of being photographed this way was psychological torture. Being repeatedly posed, displayed, discussed, as if I were an exhibit rather than a person. This created lasting trauma. Even now, years after emancipation, I am troubled by knowing those images exist. Third, I want to challenge how people view photographs from the slavery era. When you see a photograph showing an enslaved person, you should ask, how did this photograph come to exist? What power dynamics were involved? Was the person photographed by choice or by force? What was the purpose of the photograph? How was it used? Fourth, I want to document that this exploitation sometimes continued even after legal emancipation. The 1867 photograph showing me with the Hartwell sisters was taken when I was legally free, but I still felt I could not refuse their request because they retained economic and social power over me. I survived being enslaved. I survived being repeatedly photographed and displayed like an exhibit. I survived years of being treated as a specimen rather than as a person. And I am now documenting this experience so that history will understand how photography was used to dehumanize enslaved people, and so that people who view these photographs will understand the exploitation they document. Patricia reads Isaac's testimony multiple times, struck by his clear analysis of how photography was used as a tool of dehumanization, and by his description of the lasting psychological impact of being repeatedly posed and displayed. Isaac understood that photography created permanent records of exploitation, and that these images could be shown to people indefinitely, making the dehumanization permanent in a way that verbal descriptions or temporary displays were not. Patricia contacts Dr. Michael Thompson, a historian at Auburn University, who specializes in the use of photography during slavery and Reconstruction, and how images of enslaved people were created, circulated, and used to reinforce racist ideologies. Michael has spent decades researching photographs from this period and working to understand the power dynamics behind the images. Michael calls her back within an hour, his voice urgent. Isaac's testimony, if it provides detailed context for a photograph showing him posed by his enslavers, would be extraordinarily valuable. We have many photographs from the slavery era showing enslaved people in posed, staged situations, but we rarely have testimony from the people in the photographs explaining how those images were created and what they experienced. Send me everything immediately. Patricia shares all the materials with Michael. They arrange to meet at the Alabama Department of Archives and History in Montgomery to examine any additional records about Isaac, the Hartwell family, and the use of photography on plantations in 1850s, 1860s Alabama. Over the following weeks, Patricia and Michael piece together the complete story of Isaac's exploitation through photography and his life after emancipation. They find additional photographs from the Hartwell sisters' collection showing Isaac in various staged poses, some showing him lifting heavy objects, others showing him in work poses, others showing him positioned to emphasize his physical build. All the photographs show careful staging and composition, confirming Isaac's testimony that these were deliberate displays rather than casual documentation. They find contemporary accounts from people who visited the Hartwell plantation and were shown the sisters' photograph collection. From a diary entry by a visitor in 1862, the Hartwell sisters showed us their extensive collection of photographs, including many images of their strongest Negro man, whom they call Isaac. The sisters have posed him in various positions that display his unusual strength and physique. They discussed him with great pride, as one might discuss a prize horse or exceptional livestock. The photographs are quite striking. The man is indeed powerfully built. The sisters said they enjoy showing these photographs to visitors as evidence of the quality of their property. Patricia and Michael also find broader historical context about the use of photography to document and display enslaved people. Photography became more accessible in the 1850s, and some slaveholders began photographing enslaved people, sometimes for identification purposes, sometimes for pseudo-scientific racial documentation, and sometimes simply to create displays of their property. These photographs were often staged to emphasize physical characteristics, to position enslaved people as specimens or curiosities, or to demonstrate the slaveholder's power through visual documentation of ownership. Enslaved people who were photographed had no control over how they were posed, how the images were used, or who viewed them. The photographs created permanent records of exploitation that could be circulated, displayed, and preserved indefinitely. Most importantly, Patricia and Michael trace what happened to Isaac after his testimony. From Freedmen's Bureau records and city directories, they find that Isaac moved to Birmingham, Alabama in 1869 and worked as a blacksmith. He married in 1871 and had 4 children. He remained active in his church community and became known for speaking about his experiences during slavery, particularly about the psychological impact of being photographed and displayed. From a black newspaper in Birmingham in 1890, they find an article about Isaac. Mr. Isaac Freeman, a respected blacksmith and longtime resident of Birmingham, spoke at 16th Street Baptist Church about his experiences as an enslaved person who was repeatedly photographed by his enslavers. Mr. Day Freeman described how twin sisters who owned him used photography to display him as a curiosity, and how these photographs were shown to visitors as evidence of the sisters' ownership of impressive property. Mr. Freeman emphasized that photography was not a neutral technology, but was used during slavery as a tool of exploitation and dehumanization. He urged the community to remember that many photographs from the slavery era document forced poses and exploitation rather than neutral documentation. They find that Isaac lived until 1908, dying at age 68, having built a successful blacksmith business and having raised a family. His obituary notes that he was known for his advocacy work, educating people about how photography was used to exploit enslaved people. Over the following months, Patricia and Michael worked to create an exhibition examining how photography was used to dehumanize enslaved people, using Isaac's case as a central example. They work with photography historians and scholars of visual culture to provide context about how images create and reinforce power dynamics. 19 months after Patricia first examined that photograph, the Smithsonian opens the exhibition, Captured on Camera, Isaac Freeman and the Photographic Exploitation of Enslaved People. The exhibition occupies a gallery designed to challenge how viewers understand photographs from the slavery era and to center the perspectives of the people who were photographed. The centerpiece is the 1867 photograph of Isaac posed between the Hartwell sisters, displayed alongside Isaac's testimony, explaining how he was forced into this and similar poses. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. This 1867 photograph shows Isaac Freeman posed between Margaret and Catherine Hartwell, twin sisters who enslaved him. Between 1858-1867, the sisters repeatedly photographed Isaac in staged, humiliating poses designed to display him as a curiosity. They collected these photographs and showed them to visitors as evidence of their ownership of an unusually strong enslaved man. This particular photograph was taken in 1867, 2 years after legal emancipation, but Isaac testified that he still felt he could not refuse the sisters' request because they retained economic and social power. The carefully staged symmetry, Isaac's shirtless display, and the sisters' possessive positioning document exploitation disguised as portraiture. The exhibition tells Isaac's complete story through his testimony. Additional photographs from the series, contemporary accounts describing how the photographs were displayed, and documentation of Isaac's life after emancipation. But the exhibition also uses Isaac's case to examine broader patterns of how photography was used to exploit enslaved people. One section examines the history of photography during slavery, how the technology became accessible in the 1850s, how slaveholders used it to document their property, and how enslaved people had no control over how they were photographed or how images were used. Historical photographs showing enslaved people in staged, posed situations are displayed alongside analysis of the power dynamics behind these images. Another section focuses on Isaac's specific experience, displaying multiple photographs from the Hartwell sisters' collection, showing how Isaac was posed in various ways designed to display his physical strength, presenting Isaac's testimony about the psychological impact of repeated photographing and display. The exhibition makes clear that these photographs document exploitation, not neutral documentation. The exhibition includes a section on photography after emancipation, showing how some formerly enslaved people continued to be pressured into exploitative photographs even after legal freedom, as Isaac was in 1867. The exhibition examines how economic and social power dynamics persisted after legal emancipation. A section on viewing historical photographs provides guidance for how viewers should approach images from the slavery era, asking questions about consent, power dynamics, purpose, and use. The exhibition challenges viewers to see photographs as documents of specific power relationships, rather than as neutral records. The exhibition documents Isaac's life after slavery, his move to Birmingham, his work as a blacksmith, his family, his advocacy educating people about photographic exploitation. The exhibition emphasizes that Isaac survived this exploitation and built a successful life while continuing to speak about his experiences. A video plays continuously featuring historians discussing photography and slavery, visual culture scholars analyzing how images create and reinforce power dynamics, and descendants of formerly enslaved people reflecting on how photographs of their ancestors should be understood and contextualized. On opening day, Patricia stands in the gallery, watching visitors engage with the exhibition. She sees people study the photograph of Isaac with the Hartwell sisters, but now they're reading Isaac's testimony first, understanding the exploitation the image documents before viewing the image itself. Michael stands beside her, looking at the carefully constructed display that centers Isaac's perspective. The exhibition makes people confront what they're seeing, he says. That photograph of Isaac with the twin sisters, if you saw it without context, you might interpret it in various ways. But once you read Isaac's testimony, explaining that he was forced into this pose, that this was the final photograph in a series of exploitative images, that the sisters collected these photographs to display their ownership, you can't unsee that. You understand that what looks like a formal portrait is actually documentation of exploitation. A young photographer approaches them after spending a long time examining the photographs. This exhibition completely changed how I think about historical photographs, she says. I work with images every day, but I never really thought about the power dynamics behind historical photographs of enslaved people. Learning about Isaac, understanding that he was forced into these poses, that he had no control over how he was photographed or how the images were used, that the psychological impact lasted for years after emancipation. It makes me realize that every photograph embodies specific power relationships. We need to ask who had power to create the image, who had power to control how it was used, and whose perspectives are centered or erased. An elderly black man stops to read Isaac's 1890 speech for a long time. Isaac said photography was not a neutral technology, but was used during slavery as a tool of exploitation and dehumanization, he says. That's such an important point. We tend to think of photographs as just recording reality, but Isaac understood that who gets to take photographs, who gets photographed, how people are posed, how images are used. All of that involves power. The Hartwell sisters used photography to turn Isaac into a permanent exhibit, creating lasting records of his exploitation. Even after legal freedom, those images continued to exist and could continue to dehumanize him. A museum educator with a group of high school students stops at the section on viewing historical photographs. This guidance is so important, she says. Students see historical photographs all the time in textbooks and online, but they rarely think critically about how those images were created or what power dynamics they document. Teaching them to ask, who took this photograph, Did the person photographed have choice? What was the purpose? How was it used? These questions help students understand that photographs aren't neutral records but documents of specific relationships and power structures. Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, understanding that Isaac's story represents both a specific case of photographic exploitation and a broader pattern of how photography was used during slavery to dehumanize enslaved people and create permanent records of their exploitation. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Patricia walks through the gallery one more time. She stops in front of the photograph of Isaac with the Hartwell sisters, but now she sees it through the lens of Isaac's testimony, understanding the exploitation it documents, the power dynamics it embodies, the lasting impact it had on Isaac. She thinks about Isaac's life, born enslaved approximately 1840, forced to pose for dozens of photographs between ages 1827 by twin sisters who collected the images and displayed them to visitors, enduring years of being treated as a living exhibit and permanent curiosity, pressured into one final exploitative photograph, even after legal emancipation, moving to Birmingham to build a life away from his former enslavers, working as a successful blacksmith for decades, raising a family, speaking publicly about photographic exploitation, and educating people about how to understand images from the slavery era, living until 1908 at age 68, having survived exploitation and built a legacy of advocacy. She thinks about Margaret and Catherine Hartwell, who used photography to turn an enslaved man into their personal exhibit, who staged dozens of photographs designed to display their ownership and power, who continued to exploit Isaac, even after emancipation, by pressuring him into one final pose. And she thinks about all the other enslaved people who were forced to pose for photographs, whose images were used to dehumanize them, who had no control over how they were represented or how the photographs were circulated and displayed. The photograph waited 158 years to be properly contextualized. The image that might initially appear to be simply a formal portrait has been revealed through Isaac's testimony as documentation of exploitation, a carefully staged tableau designed to display power and ownership, created through coercion rather than consent, preserved to create permanent records of dehumanization. Now the photograph and exhibition have fulfilled a purpose Isaac would have wanted. His testimony has been preserved and centered. His perspective has been prioritized over the visual spectacle. Viewers have been taught to question the power dynamics behind historical photographs, and future generations can understand that photography during slavery was often a tool of exploitation that created lasting trauma for the people who were forced to pose and be displayed as exhibits rather than recognized as human beings. As visitors file past the image one last time, many now viewing it last after reading Isaac's testimony first, understanding the exploitation before seeing its visual documentation, Patricia reflects on all the other photographs from the slavery era that need similar contextualization, all the other images that document exploitation disguised as portraiture, all the other perspectives from people who were photographed that need to be recovered and centered so viewers can understand what they're actually seeing when they look at these historical images. Isaac Freeman, born enslaved approximately 1840, forced to pose for dozens of exploitative photographs between 1858-1867 by enslavers who displayed him as a living curiosity, endured psychological trauma from being repeatedly exhibited and permanently documented, survived this exploitation and moved to Birmingham, where he built successful blacksmith business, married and raised family, spent decades educating people about photographic exploitation during slavery, lived until 1908, at age 68, having created legacy of advocacy that helps people understand how photography was used as tool of dehumanization. His story has been told, his testimony has been centered, and Patricia is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that this photograph, and others like it, will be understood not as neutral historical documents, but as records of specific exploitative relationships, viewed through the perspectives of the people who were forced to pose, rather than through the eyes of those who wielded the camera as an instrument of power and permanent dehumanization.